Back in the summer of 1997, I was an 11-year-old kid who had just finished the 5th grade. For some weeks prior, getting out of school, my dad and I had made plans to go on a dual father-son camping trip with my cousin, Ryan, and my uncle, Steven. My dad was friends with a rich businessman who owned several acres of rural private property, about 40 miles from our city of Fargo, North Dakota. So, we were all pretty excited to be able to go on our trip without being disturbed by other people. We left in my uncle's pickup truck the day after my cousin and I got out of school. We'd spent the morning loading it up with things you'd expect to take on a camping trip: tents, fishing gear, and so forth. However, I was most excited about the fact that my dad and Steven promised to teach me and Ryan how to hunt over the weekend, so they brought their guns as well. We got to the campsite and began to set up. My dad and uncle telling me and Ryan that they wouldn't even take their guns out of the truck until we gathered enough branches to make a fire for later that evening. So, we got to it, running around as fast as we could, getting a good exploration of the campsite in the meantime. It was pretty nice. It had a lot of old tall trees and a creek that we planned on fishing in sometime during the weekend. Atop of that, there was plenty of game. I couldn't even count the amount of deer that Ryan and I scared off due to us running around. We finally returned, and as it got towards the afternoon, we stopped to eat the lunch that we'd pre-packed. Other than some fruit, nuts, and beans, we didn't bring anything more to eat past our meals. My dad and Steven told us that we'd mostly be feeding ourselves off of whatever we caught or hunted, as they claimed that being self-sufficient and getting your own food was an essential part of learning how to be a man. So, we got to shooting as soon as our stomachs were full. After giving the basic safety instructions, like trigger discipline and how to properly hold a rifle, Ryan and I were shooting at empty cans and bottles, receiving numerous amounts of praise whenever we hit our target. After we were done with target practice, we were invited to go along with our dads to watch them hunt. We'd get the opportunity to try hunting the next day. They were already dressed in neutral-colored clothes, so Ryan and I had to take extra care to conceal ourselves behind the trees and bushes. Ryan whispered to our dads about how he had spotted a coyote, pointing to the distance. I could see something shifting through the tree line, but it was hard to make out. Our dads quietly made their way towards the location, but by the time they got nearby, it was gone, and only the rotting corpse of a headless deer remained. It had been decaying there for some time, to the point where it had an entire swarm of flies buzzing about. Steven joked that the coyote didn't even want it to stick around because of the rotten food. He then narrowed his eyes as he further inspected the carcass and noted how the severing of the deer's head was completely clean. My dad commented about how he had never heard of a single coyote taking off the head of a deer, and that it must have been the work of an entire pack. I suggested that the pack only took the deer's head off after it died. My dad and uncle just shrugged. Figuring it was plausible enough explanation, we stumbled upon the head after going a few yards away, all 4 of us instantly perplexed by the sight of it. It was horribly mangled, but the strange part was that the piece of one of its own antlers were broken off and penetrated deeply into its left eye socket. Steven asked how the hell that even happened. My dad responded that he personally didn't know. He then laughed as he looked back at me and Ryan, and joked about how we'd have to compete with coyotes in order to get our game. Ryan commented on how it looked like a human did the work. Steven replied that if it was the case, then they were trespassing, and their gun should be enough to scare anyone off. We continued on with our hunting trip. Our dads managed to catch a doe, and we started our fire as soon as we returned to the campsite with it. We skinned it as the sun started setting, and by the time night fell, we were finishing up cooking our deer meat. We had some beans as a side. Our dad sat back and relaxed with some beer, and while I could wait until morning to try hunting, Ryan could not. While our dads were buzzed, Ryan took one of the rifles and encouraged me to come hunting with them. I was worried I'd get in trouble, and Ryan called me a pussy. As I was a young boy who desperately wanted to be seen as tough, full-grown man, I hesitantly agreed to join him on his endeavor. We brought a flashlight with us and made our way back into the trees, using the dim light from the campfire as our beacon to where to return. Ryan held the rifle while I shone the flashlight into the woods, and it wasn't too long before our dads were calling out our names, trying to find out where we'd gone. I suggested going back, but just as I did, we heard something scamper nearby. Ryan insisted that there was no way he was heading back now, and that he was going to shoot whatever this thing was. He grabbed the flashlight from me, pointing it in the direction where the animal was. The first thing I saw was a pair of eyes reflecting the light before they ascended well above the ground. When Ryan moved the position of the flashlight, it revealed something I had never seen before in my life. It had to be about 8 or 9 feet tall, but I couldn't tell as its body, which was practically human, stood in a hunched over stance. It was covered in black fur from head to toe, and its broad shoulders and massive arms led down the huge claws, which stuck out from its paw-like hands, just like daggers. Its ribcage, so large, poked out from its chest as it breathed heavily, and its heaving only stopped to let out a harsh snarl at us. After overcoming the shock of the situation, Ryan and I screamed, and he dropped the gun and began to run. I knew there was no way we can go faster than that thing, so I picked the rifle back up as it leapt towards me and fired it. It let out a yelp, and I began making a break for it, the campfire getting ever closer to my line of sight as I got further away. Our dads were pissed at us for sneaking off and took the rifle away as soon as I got back. Ryan was full on crying at this point, trying to convey what we had stumbled upon, but neither of our dads took it seriously. I backed him up, but it didn't help much. Stephen guessed it was a black bear and couldn't have been a wolf, as there weren't many in the area. I told him I shot at it and thought I killed it, and that I could show him where it was. My father, who was not amused, told us to get our asses to sleep and that we'd be going home as soon as the morning came around. So that meant no hunting, no fishing, or anything else. He said we had lost those privileges as soon as we snuck off with a gun. I was bummed and even wanted to try and put the blame on Ryan, but I was exhausted at that point and got ready for bed. Ryan and I shared a tent, so we discussed what happened. Neither of us had ever seen anything like it before and didn't know what to make of it. We both laid there in the night, wide awake, despite being tired. Nobody would be able to sleep after such an event, especially a kid. But just as I began to relax, I heard the same heavy breathing from our encounter in the woods earlier. My heart began to race, and although it was hard to see in the darkness, Ryan and I reflected the same fearful look as we both knew it had returned. He whispered to me that he thought I'd killed it, and told him that I thought I did too. We attempted to get the attention of our dads, doing the best yell whisper we could, but that only caught the attention of the creature. We saw the outline of its claws pressed up against the tent, as it seemed to try and figure out what was inside. Not knowing what else to do, Ryan and I grabbed each other, trying our best to remain quiet, and I had tears silently rolling down my cheeks. We heard our dad's tent slowly unzip from a few yards away. The creature, whatever this thing was, removed its claw from ours in favor of focusing its attention on theirs. Both Ryan and I jumped as we heard the sound of a whistle, and a few moments later, a gunshot, and then another, followed by a flurry of them. We screamed as our tent unzipped, but it was just Stephen, and he asked if we were all right. We nodded. I saw my dad appear from the tree line, gun in hand. He caught his breath as he made his way up to us. He looked at Stephen for a moment before explaining that it was a black bear and was probably just looking for something to eat. Ryan asked if he killed it. My dad insisted that if it was not dead, then it surely would be in the next few minutes. He then proposed leaving as soon as possible. Stephen didn't seem to oppose the idea, so within minutes we were all in the truck and headed back towards Fargo. My dad was a pretty courageous man, and I found the idea of him being spooked by a black bear to be pretty odd. He got rid of the threat anyway, so I couldn't understand what the problem was. He didn't seem to be in the mood to talk though, so I didn't prod or ask. We ended up crashing at my uncle's house for the night, and my aunt made us breakfast in the morning as my dad and Stephen went back to the campsite to fetch their things. After they returned, I went home with my father. Since the camping trip was already planned to have been cut short, I didn't bother even trying to bring up one prospect or another. I didn't want to return to that campsite anyway, even though my dad insisted that the animal that was bothering us was just a black bear, and that it was now dead. I was scared of it regardless. As time passed, I mostly just shoved the memory out of my mind. But it wasn't until 5 years later did my father actually tell me the truth. The creature that was outside of mine and Ryan's tent was in fact exactly as we described it to be. My dad said that this creature, this being, was called the Dogman, and that they are nocturnal hunters and are only living in certain areas of the woods in the U.S. That he has actually never seen one before, and that was his first time. He has only ever heard of them, but that is why he didn't want us to go out there alone in the middle of the woods at night. He didn't want to scare us, so he lied about the description, hoping that it wouldn't terrify us too much. Part of me wishes technology was viable enough at the time to have been able to get a good chance to get a good photo or video of this thing. It wasn't like I would have thought to bring a camera with me. However, another part of me knows it doesn't even matter, because no matter what, I'll have